Oh, do 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 do. No, nothing. Oh, there we go. All right. Yeah, let's see if I can make that bigger. Too big. All right. Blinds down. All right. Woo, that was loud. So, welcome. We're in the dog days of the semester. So we'll be done before you know it. So really quickly today, we're going to finish up talking about mixed methods. I'll try to be brief, just to kind of get to the real basics that are left. If we end a little bit early today, or a lot early, or whatever, we'll just call it that. Next class, I'm going to really condense, my analytics for qual, and try to get everything in as quickly as possible in terms of content, just to, get it done with and then, be finished with the content and let you all focus on other things. Before I jump into, the rest of mixed methods, excuse me, for today, I did want to just go over come on, brain. I just want to go over the second major lab. Just basically kind of see if you have any questions about it, kind of really quickly explain. I can go through the rubric if that was helpful last time. No, Chloe's like, nah, not helpful. But if you have any questions on the major lab, now is a good time to ask. Yeah, Mia.
So with all the mini labs we've done, can we kind of build off of all of that?
Of course, yeah. So same as the first major lab. Feel free to use the same research question, the same materials, obviously with revisions if you were suggested revisions and all of that stuff. But yeah, you don't have to create a brand new project from scratch. Same as the first one. Yeah, please.
Could you give an example for this major lab too, like you did for the first
I can do that, and I should have thought of that already, but I'm bird-brained this semester. I'll do that today. I'm like still struggling to get like your mini lab 5 completely marked, and today I did about 12 of them, and then at some point I was also building a slide show for another class, and at some point I just ended up in Microsoft's Copilot generating images of Jesus eating Thai food. I don't know. I'm not even joking, because I'm inviting a friend of mine to go eat Thai food. So I made images of Jesus and Nietzsche eating Thai food, and for like 5 or 15 minutes of my time just disappeared. I don't know. I was experimenting, like what religious figures could I get to into this image, and I could get Buddha. There's a tons of things. Yeah, please.
So for in the first part where we have to put in a hypothesis for what we think we'll find, do we need to justify or explain why we think so?
I mean, just an outline of what you think the results might be. It doesn't have to be very in depth in terms of why you think you'll find that. Like a short explanation will more than suffice.
Okay.
Like maybe couple sentences, short paragraph at most, but don't beat your head against the wall trying to think of, you can go do research. Certainly, I always appreciate that. If you cite a paper, it's like, well, this was found in Smith, Smith, and Smith, or Smith at all the Smiths. but you don't have to do that. So, okay, you said you had several questions.
For the methodology and justification section, so are we also going to be talking about incorporating a quantitative component in that part?
No, so that one is left for part 6,
Okay.
right? I mean, if you want to include it in that section, right? If you just want to kind of build a project that you're going to say is fully integrated, and you're going to say, I'm going to do this, this quantitative portion and this qualitative portion, you can do it there. I'm smart enough to figure out that you put it in a different part. But if you want to be super safe and assume that I'm sleep deprived, you can put it at the end. I saw something flicker, but I think it was your screen. It's like, what? Why is the screen off? What's happening? I've become extremely jumpy. But yeah, so you can integrate it into the rest of the project, if you like, into that part of the project if you want, or you can put it in a section 6 that's separate. It's entirely up to you how you want to structure it. And if I give it back to you and you don't think I've been fair, you can always, query me and be like, but hey, I have it here, and all that stuff.
And for,
Okay, one more, and then I'll go back to Mia for a second. Yeah.
So for the sample of research materials, can this just be interview questions?
Yes. Oh, and we have here interview schedule. I should highlight this just very quickly. An interview schedule is just and I should change the wording, and I keep forgetting to do it. That means like your interview guide, right? Or your sample interview questions. I had one person one time actually give me like, I will interview Joe on Tuesday. That's not what an interview schedule is. I was like, this is very precise, but not what I'm looking for. So yeah, a sample interview guide, right? So you can have your interview questions, which, that's what you did for mini lab number 5, which I will return to you if I haven't already in very short order. Mia and then Chloe.
For the consent letter, can we use the same consent letter we used last for like the first major lab?
Yes, just modify it for the project, because probably you're doing a different project. I will say that for the information and consent letter on this one, it's worth less. Like on the first major lab, you got a mark out of 5. For this one, it's just out of 3, because I figured by now you've done it 3 times, so I'm going to grant you less marks because it should be easy now. And if you can't get it right at this point and you end up in limited report, you just get 0. I'm sorry. Yeah, please.
Define the concepts that are most important to study. I know in like the quantitative one, we did like the operative and everything.
Operational
ones.
And nominal.
Do you want us to do that
So
again? Or?
you can, right? That's certainly, like if you want to just stick with what you know, right? You can do a nominal and an operational definition. Now, obviously, the operational definition is going to look different in qualitative, right? Because you're going to be, operationalizing it through some kind of interview question. So, and it's going to be a little bit less kind of empirical and scientific. So you just have to take that into account. At very least, if you don't want to do the concepts in that way, what is it you're trying to understand, right? Like, are there 2 things? Like, are you trying to understand, like, sacred space, how young people conceptualize sacred space, right? Like, I only use that because I was reading about this morning, right? How do young people conceptualize sacred space? Well, then, of course, you're going to have to define what you mean by sacred space, right? That concept, you need to give me at least a sort of nominal definition of it to understand, or sacred experiences, or the sacred. You'd have to define that. And obviously, young people, like, give me a range of who you're talking to or stuff like that. Chloe.
Question. When it comes to a methodology, do you just want like I'm doing an interview and then explaining that?
Yeah, and justify why you think that would be the best methodology, right? Why? I mean, you don't have to contrast it with other ones, but you should keep in mind, like, why do you think that would be appropriate, as opposed to, say, an ethnography or content analysis or something like that, right? So you should have an idea of why. Does that make sense? Oh, you had 2. You had 2.
Yes.
Or 12. I don't know which.
I honestly can't remember what my questions were now, but
Do you want me to come back to you?
well, do we have a lab today?
Yes, with Celine.
Great.
All right. Perfect.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. So we just really provide like a nominal definition I'm confident.
Yeah, as long as I know what, like, you can define what concepts you're actually wanting to study, right? So, because just sometimes people get a little fuzzy with the concepts. It's like they know they're doing interviews, but they don't have a sense of what they're trying to understand, even out of their research question. Like, what concepts would you be kind of thinking about, right? You remembered your question.
Yes. How many interview questions would you like?
Uh,
Does it say? I can't read.
I don't know. How many did I have? Was it 10 questions for the... Yeah, so, I mean, 15 to 20, probably, would be good. Expand a little bit on what you did, reformulate, rework, all that fun stuff. There was another... Was it your hand? No. Okay. Well, no one else has their hand up anymore, so go ahead.
When you're doing like, when I just forget, but when you're doing interviews with a group of people,
Focus groups.
does that include the same 15 to 20 questions for those, or?
Yeah. I mean, because obviously you still have a guy. It's going to look a little bit different, right? Because you're...
Like potential responses?
No, just give me the question. You don't have to do like a pretend interview where you pretended to interview someone. Some people do that. I mean, if you want to do a little drama, get the method, you really do the method thing, go for it. But you don't need to think of the potential responses that people will have. And you don't need to, obviously, you don't need a mock interview and your reflections on it. That was just for the mini lab to get you thinking about how do these questions work. Though, I mean, people came up with some really good reflections out of those mock interviews. So it might behoove you, if you're doing an interview, just run it by someone. You don't have to tell me about it, but it seemed like it helped people, right?
So for the methodology and everything, is a solo interview and focus group, are those two different methodologies?
Yes.
Okay.
And you want to, say if you're doing a focus group, you'd want to just say why you're going to do focus groups as opposed to solo interviewing, right? And they're used for slightly different purposes, right? So yeah, why do you think maybe a focus group would be more appropriate in this case? Or a solo interview, right? Sarah?
The initial question I had in relapse, I don't like it. If I change it, is that okay?
Oh yeah, of course. No, you don't have to stick with, it's not like, no, come on. You came up with a question, you're stuck with it forever, you can never change. This is who you are now. No, you can change it. If you want to run it by me, feel free to. I know we have a meeting, but that's pretty late, like next week, Friday or something. Is it this week, Friday? Okay, that's not as late as I thought. I know it's in there somewhere. It's in my calendar to remind me. But yeah, you can run it by me then if you want, or send me an email and I can give you some quick feedback on it.
And is next Tuesday also the review before we hand it in?
Like a drop-in? Or yeah, I'll be there. I might move upstairs because I hate that room. So I might move it into my office in the CCR space or the space across the hall. But I'll let you know. But yeah, I'll definitely have a drop-in time if people want to just kind of come in and run ideas past me. And I'm trying to remember what the deadline is for it, but if you need extensions, I know it's a crazy time of year, do feel free to ask for an extension. I'm pretty flexible on the whole with extensions and such. So don't be if you don't feel like you're going to do your best work by the deadline, I can be flexible within a few days. And I know how hectic a time of year it is. I know I'm not the only assignment you have due and all that stuff. So just ask and it shall be granted, right? It's easy going that way. Other questions about Major Lab numero 2? Tanucci.
For this simple interview question, if we're doing a focus group and then interview, do you split up what is specifically a focus group question and what is an interview question?
That would certainly be a best practice. Otherwise, me reading it is going to be very confused. I would just, if you're going to do both, again, you want to justify why you're going to go in either a sequence, which one are you going to do first? Make sure you say that, are you going to start with interviews, then focus groups, and then why, or vice versa, and why. And then, split it up for me just so that it's super clear and I can't be stupid and just quickly read your thing and be terrible, 3, because I do read them pretty fast, right? I mean, both a fast reader and I have a lot of stuff to mark, so I try to do my best. Or I'll give it to Celine and then you're You're doomed with the grad student who marks too harshly. No, Celine's great. I kid. Grad students always mark really harshly because they are like holding you up to grad student levels of kind of competence, which is totally not fair. But if you were marked by Celine last time, you will not be marked by Celine this time. You'll be marked by me because I always flip it. So, and she does less than I do. So you might get me both times. And I do look them over and all that stuff. So, other questions?
There's something, I don't know where it is, but it says something about like, where example of the content being analyzed and or the coding categories for content analysis. What exactly do you want to like say for content analysis?
Okay, like if you're doing it, like if you were are you doing content analysis?
That's like where I'm starting.
Okay.
Background, like a literature review.
Okay, so I mean, like, you would want to give like a sort of sense there. Like you could do a little bit of like sample content analysis, right? So like something like what we did in class, or you can do just like codes, right? So you're gonna you're looking for these kinds of themes in a media text, right? So you've already broken it down. I don't know, you're looking at, Trudeau's media appearances and you're going to like break it down by different codes, right? Like the economy, housing, SOCs. He talked about SOCs with Gavin Newsom again. So embarrassing. Or, whatever, like all the themes that you might be looking for in there, feminism, right? So you could have like your kind of sample coding guide. You'd want it to be, and maybe how you would apply it in a short section. That would be, I think, good. Coding categories for that. The plan of content analysis, like what are you going to actually look at? How are you going to analyze it? All of that kind of stuff. And be fairly detailed in it because it is a little bit different than, say, interviews. It's a little bit harder to grade, so give me lots to work with. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because my thing is I'm also adding in like my sample interview questions because I'm doing that too.
Okay.
So
You've decided to go the path of complexity. That's great. Yeah. So just provide, again, as much detail in that section as you can, just to give me an idea. You need to give me something to mark, right? So hopefully that makes sense. There was another question, I think, but I lost you. I don't know where you are. No? No? Okay. You keep opening and closing devices. Sarah's got like 12 devices. She could just shuffle between them. I was like, what is this? I have too many devices too. It's just kind of funny. I'm like,
It's because like the iPad is useless. You can't do anything. Like if I want to go with my dogs, I can't do it on my iPad. But like it's good for notes.
right.
I'll switch back and forth.
I have a friend who's like a Mac and Apple junkie, and he tried to convince me that I could replace my laptop with an iPad. So I tried while I was on holidays because I'm like, I'll just bring an iPad. I bought the keyboard thingy with the mouse, and I'm like, this is terrible. What are you even talking about? He's like, well, for light tasks. I'm like, okay. Not even good for that, but all right, sure. Hi, Wednesday's lab. Anyone in Wednesday's lab? I'll send, if the announcements thread on eClass isn't working right now, so I've been having trouble sending out announcements. Celine, we'll be starting the lab on Wednesday at 3:30 instead of 3 because she has a conflict. So, yes, I'll try to send that out if they fix eClass, or if eClass gets more broken. This is your only warning. How could eClass get more broken? A worthy enigma. Okay. Any last questions on the assignment? We can always you can always ask again next class. That's no problem. Let's talk mixed methods. And we'll try to get you out of here as quickly as possible. That already took half an hour, so I think we're in good shape.
left yourself a little note to start here.
Yeah, because I would have clearly forgotten. You have no idea how many times I go back and watch the video recording of last class, like 10 minutes before class, to try and figure out where I was. I'm like, where did I end off this class? Like, I have no idea. So yes, I've just started to write on the slide. start here. Why not? Okay. Ta-da. It's so weird. This computer makes it must be the aspect ratio. I have 2 laptops, and this is my bigger one, and I left the other one at home because my son insists that he has to be allowed to play Minecraft on my PC after work. I never should have installed. I should have just said, keep playing on your Switch. He's like, I want to play Java with my cousin. And I'm like, this sounds like English, but I don't know what any of it means. So now I'm using this big one, which weighs about twice as much. But apparently it expands bigger on the screen than the other one. So I don't know. I don't understand what's happening in my life anymore. Okay. Nope. Yes. Okay. I'm happy. And can I write on it? Because last time I used this computer, I couldn't write on it. Sweet. All right. Everything works. All right. So when you're thinking of your assignment, right? And you're thinking of, your mini lab number 6, and you're thinking of, how do I integrate a quantitative component with this qualitative project? Or, if you went back in time and I asked you to integrate a qualitative component with your quantitative work, one of the big questions that ends up being really important, what methods go together? So what can you do? And what is the order of things, right? Which one would you do first? Okay, so one of the ways that you could do it, right? So there's basically 2 paths, right? You can do the quantitative part beforehand to inform your qualitative. So quant, use it to gather information and then use it to inform your qualitative portion, or do quantitative after to help give you more kind of data on things that you found in the qualitative research. So qualitative research can be used to examine quantitative methods. So here in this one, right, you would start with quantitative and you would go then to qualitative. Start with quantitative, go to qualitative analysis, right? So don't worry about, for example, meta-ethnography can compare findings from different settings and contexts not otherwise accessible to a single researcher. But let's not worry too much about that. One of the things that I'll say, that example is a little bit out there, and we're not going to talk about meta-ethnography. So one of the things that I think is really interesting that you can do, right, and this is how I've preferred to do things, is that you take, I should probably answer Celine because she's probably freaking out as to whether that works. You know what? She can wait an hour. I'll tell her in an hour. I've told you already. Okay. Take quantitative, right? And do your quantitative research, and then use the things that you find and go out and do qualitative research that interrogates the things that you found, right? So you can examine your qualitative method, right? Your findings from your qualitative data using, interviews or ethnography or something like that, right? So it's usually you find themes, and sometimes people do it quantitative is sort of the fact finding, and then qualitative is you go dig into the why, right? This is my favorite approach. It doesn't mean you have to use it, but I like using quantitative before qualitative, just because I find it kind of really, really useful. And yeah, I think pretty clearly I'm a mixed methods kind of fan in general, and I think the best studies I've ever seen are all kind of mixed methods and usually quant to qual, because you can get so much richer data from going this kind of direction, right? You get the what out of the quant, you get the why out of the qual. Okay, quantification in qualitative research. Okay, so this is kind of a funny thing that people do. I guess it's not maybe that funny, but some people will do things you're just doing qualitative research, right? And you are then going to kind of give it a quasi-quantitative feel by doing, a bunch of things. So, one of them would be, hang on, I'm going to switch my pen to white because I know this doesn't work in red. thematic analysis. So in thematic analysis, right, what you would do is sort of like look at, say, your qualitative data. And you've done focus groups, right? And themes kind of came up all the time, right? It's like, yeah, I don't know. Should I go back to my furries example? Right? Furries are all about finding your authentic self, authentic self, authentic self, right? This phrase gets used a whole bunch. And, whatever other themes come up, right? Connecting with nature or animal spirit, whatever. I have absolutely no idea. Right? You might say, that, okay, this theme comes up in, a majority of the interviews, right? So you kind of give it, an implicit quantification, right? The identification and prominence of certain themes rather than others, right? The theme of finding your authentic self came up twice as often as, connecting with your animal spirit or, whatever furries talk about, right? So that would be one kind of quantitative way of doing things. Okay, quasi-quantification, right? In qualitative research, you could say, oh, sorry, Mia.
Sorry, I don't understand thematic analysis, how it's quantitative, like if you're doing a focus group or focus groups.
So they're qualitative, right? But you would be doing, so if you were doing thematic analysis, you would sort of so you would do your coding, right? And you would say, okay, this theme came up a bunch of times, right? This theme of, I don't know, your authentic self. And then you would kind of, as you're writing up your results, you would sort of imply a quantitative kind of way of framing it without actually doing quantitative research, right? You wouldn't actually be doing statistics on it, but you would say this theme was explored, twice as often as that one, right? So that's kind of you're talking about quantities, but you're not actually doing statistical research or doing surveys or anything like that.
Just to clarify, so you basically just dumb it down. You're counting the ways of what theme is mentioned, how many times in comparison to others.
Yeah, and I mean, because I kind of did this backwards. If once you put something in, say, coding software, so something like NVivo, right? You would basically if you're going through your interview transcripts, you would highlight a phrase, right? And then in one sidebar, you have your codes, and you would just drag that in, and it'll then count them for you, right? So it'd be okay, your authentic self, that was in my interviews with furries, that was mentioned 297 times, right? And, connecting with nature was only mentioned 140. Right? And then you'd be oh, this theme comes up about twice as often, right? That's a good question. That make kind of sense. You're not actually doing quantitative research, and the research isn't based on, wow, that must be the most important thing because it's mentioned more. You're giving it a kind of quantitative feel without actually digging deep into it. Yeah.
Qualitative, doing entry, you look at recurring themes anyway, so why is that quantitative?
It's just, again, it's not fully quantitative. You're just giving almost you're using quantitative language to describe your qualitative research. Does that help? No? Okay. Kind of, hopefully. I don't know how else to explain it. It's yeah, I mean, it's, again, one of the things that is almost universally true is that when you speak about things in numbers, it anchors it down for people, right? So, and it gives it a more scientific kind of feel to your research, right? That that this theme came up twice as often. Now, I've never actually done this because I've never thought that was a particularly useful way to present my data. But I've seen lots of people talk about interview data where it's yeah, in 90% of the cases, they said this, right? Or this came up 3 times as often, or that kind of thing. The numbers just kind of give it that feel of empiricism that people really like. And especially for social scientists, where we tend to be written off often as less valid, say, than the natural sciences. Sometimes people like to put that in there just to give it that kind of tangible, numbers-based kind of approach. Okay, you're satisfied. I'll move on. Quantification, quasi-quantification in qual research, right? Things like the use of like often, many, often, rarely, right? So I guess like in, say, Christian Smith's book, what was it, Souls in Transition, which came out of this big national study called the National Study of Youth and Religion, he'll talk about in a minority of cases, right? Or, so the majority was this, in a minority of cases this, right? So, or you can say many people said, we often heard, or rarely did people ever talk about social justice or something like that, right? So you're not actually using numbers there, so it would be less precise than what I was talking about here, right? It's not like in half the cases. It's more like many, often, just to give people a sense of the frequency. So it's not quantification technically, but you're giving a sense of whether there's a lot of frequency or infrequency in what you're describing. Combating anecdotalism through limited quantification. Yeah, using actual numbers can counter the criticism that qualitative data are too anecdotal, right, and do nothing to indicate the extent of certain beliefs, right? So if you do something like...
Sorry, does this count as like a mixed method? Like if you're doing your major lab 2 and you're like, many times people said this in my answer, does that count as quantitative? Like you have to use like surveys and interviews.
I would prefer you did that for like, think about how you would actually mix the two methods more completely than something like this. But a lot of people do this because it's easier. Not for your, I would say for your, because you're, okay, the reason that someone would do something like this is probably A, because they're not a quantitative researcher, right? And a lot of quantitative researchers are fine doing qual work. The opposite is not always true. Like because quantitative involves a certain skill set, working with stats in particular. And so a lot of qualitative researchers will really shy away from stats and quant methods because they're scared, right? Or they don't know how to run something in R really in a very sophisticated way, or SPSS. And they don't have the time to learn. So they'll shy away from it. The other thing is, obviously, budgets are not unlimited, right? And so sometimes you just have to kind of pick a lane. And so people will do this kind of quantification-y type of work with qualitative data, A, because they're not comfortable, or B, because they just don't have the scope in their research project to do both. In your case, you're just imagining a project. You don't actually have to do it. So dream big, right? Imagine that you're surveying 4,000 people and doing 400 interviews with your massive research team and grad students that I'm sure you'll have one day. Does that make sense? Okay. No, that wasn't you raising your hand. That was you just moving. Okay. Like the dog from Up, I'm attracted by motion that I think is squirrels. I'm going to tell you something completely random, but funny. I've been playing with this image generator, and I generated Dumbledore as a squirrel. And I don't know why, but I was tremendously amused by Dumbledore as a squirrel.
What is the image generator?
What's that?
What is the image?
So it's built into Bing now. It's called Copilot, and you just like click on the sidebar in Edge, and it has a little like logo on the top that used to be Bing, and now it's Copilot. And you can just ask it to generate random images. And yeah, I generated Dumbledore as a squirrel. It was hilarious. I don't know why I did it. I can't explain it. I'll show you at the end of class if I have time. I'll show you Dumbledore. That'll be your gift for today is What's that? I definitely have Jesus eating Thai food. Okay. I have Jesus and Nietzsche eating Thai food together, because those are two of the figures. I also had Jesus giving Constantine a high five. I don't know if I saved that one, but I was like, what can I make this thing do? And can it actually, and it did it as like an Eastern Orthodox icon. It was like, I was like, this is amazing. What is this? So now I'm like, I have to change how I illustrate my PowerPoint slides. I have to generate completely random images using this technology. I don't know why anymore. Except sometimes it does a really bad job. And sometimes it just tells you can't do things for no reason. It's like, this violates our content policy. I'm like, I asked it to have Charles Darwin and Jesus eating Thai food, and apparently that crossed some kind of boundary. I don't know why exactly.
Evolution on one hand and religion on the other.
Right, but then I put Nietzsche in there, and it was fine with that. And Nietzsche was like fundamentally anti-religion. Anyway, I don't understand, but it's fun to play around with. I can try and show you some of the results. Anyway, there's all sorts of randomness. I tried to recreate my daughter's stuffed animals as like actual figures, and she has a mouse from Douglas that wears a pink tutu, and I have it wielding a chainsaw. It's hilarious. It's horrifying, but hilarious. This is what I do in my spare time. When I'm stuck at traffic lights, I get Bing to generate random images. Because I can't take boredom. Okay. So what did I say? Did I say combating anecdotalism through limited quantification? You can try to give a kind of things like, this kind of thematic analysis. Sometimes like the criticism of qual research is it's too anecdotal, right? It's just a bunch of people talking and it's not generalizable. And you can combat that through kind of trying to quantify what you found, especially if you have a large number of interviews or a lot of people in focus groups, right? Okay, I'll do this really quickly. There's arguments against multi-strategy research. The big one is, right, that basically each kind of research, right, whether you're talking my pen is dead now. Oh, I'm writing in white, that's why. White slide, white text. All right, got to change. Red, again. This is so much worse in SOC of religion where I'm like circling things on graphs. Everybody hates that I found my Surface Pen again. Basically, the embedded methods argument and why people will say you can't do mixed methods is that qual and quant comes from fundamentally different philosophical, like epistemological and epistemological and ontological positions, right? One assumes kind of a social reality that can be measured. It's empiricist. The other one assumes, a social constructivist position. Right, so participant observation means that you need to take an interpretivist position that's, incompatible with the natural science model. And this is usually the argument that people make against, someone trying to do a mixed method studies. Is like they come from different places, they're looking at different things, they have different philosophical assumptions, so you can't mix them. Now, I think, unfortunately, a lot of people kind of fall into this. And I know, like in our department, we have a really hard qual-quant sort of separation where the really hard qualitative people and quantitative people often don't want to talk because they don't like each other's approaches. But I think the richest studies that I've ever seen, right, really are those that combine interviews and survey research, because they each tell a kind of different side of the story and they get at different kinds of information. With quantification, you can get scale, right? You can get a picture of basically what a whole population looks at, which you can't do with qualitative research because you're never going to interview, a representative sample of anything. It's simply unfeasible and basically impossible. But that quant method, you can't get into the why, right? And you can't understand, you can theorize on things, but you really can never get to how people have made those meanings, why they made certain choices, and all of these kinds of things. So they are just, I think they're better together. And I think those, arguments, the embedded methods argument and such things really just get too much into the weeds and too much into their heads and philosophical debates about which method is better, and you should ignore it entirely. Okay. The paradigm argument, basically is quantitative and qualitative approaches are based on separate paradigms that, you can't make. So these are similar, right? The embedded methods argument, right, is that, based on certain ontological and epistemological assumptions, those lead to certain methodologies. The paradigm argument is basically another way of phrasing the same kind of set of concerns, that, quantitative and qualitative approaches are based on different paradigms, epistemologically, and that they're not compatible, right? You can't mix them. So here, don't say mixed methods, say multi-methods. Like, I'm exploring different parts of the same question using these different tools, and you can skirt things like the paradigm argument, right? And they do have, we talked about this last time, and I know it was maybe a little bit abstract, but they do have areas where they overlap as well, right? And quantitative researchers are interested in the why, and they try to design quantitative questions that get to the why. They have open com boxes on surveys to try and get to why. Yeah, Chloe.
So what exactly is the difference between the embedded methods argument and the paradigm argument? Because they sound exactly similar.
They are essentially, okay, so the difference is, basically, if you're talking about an embedded methods argument, right? So that, say, empiricism, right? Empiricism has embedded within it a certain kind of methodology, right? It has a bunch of assumptions, right? There's a real social world that you can measure. And that empiricism is the best way of measuring things. And therefore, it's going to lead you to a particular methodology, right? That methodology is embedded within those assumptions. And the same thing for qualitative, right? Because of their assumptions, you have to use a certain methodology to get at that information. For the paradigm one, basically you can't mix them, right? They're so different, right? They each come from a different paradigm. So any attempt to mix those two ideas together ends up with something slightly gibberishy, right? Because now you're mixing completely incompatible ways of looking at the world. And so the data that's going to come out of it is going to be kind of illegitimate in the sense that you've now mixed completely different worldviews together. So the data is going to be kind of incomprehensible or somehow tainted, right? Because now you've tried to do, now you've got this qualitative component with quantitative data, and it's now just kind of, you've tainted that data because they should remain separate because they don't work together at all. Does that make sense?
So the first method is more like it could work, and then the second is like it's not going to work at all.
Well, the first one is you have to use this method with this system. So you can't mix the methods. They have to remain separate because they have fundamentally different worldviews. And this one is, if you start mixing it, your data is not going to make sense anymore, right? Because now you're mixing things that are not, oil or water and nitroglycerin, or nitro and glycerin, right? It's going to go kablooey in your face, and it's just not going to work. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You look like you're frowning.
But this next-
No, I meant Januji. She's like, I don't like that. Okay. Do you have a question, or you'll just keep making faces at me? That's all good. Makes life more amusing. Yeah. These are very similar arguments, right? The epistemological argument, they're epistemologically, right? How we learn things about the epistemology, right? If you remember what epistemology means, is how we know what we know, how we learn about the world. Quant and qual are based on incompatible epistemological principles, and therefore, they're ontologically incompatible. You can't mix them. And these are very similar. Yeah, Mia.
Because of these arguments are all very similar in the idea of why, on the exam we have to memorize every single.
I will make sure there is they're asked in very general ways. Okay. I promise. I will not. And it's probably this is not going to be a short answer question. It might be one multiple choice question. I promise. More or less. All right. I won't hurt you much. More than I have to. I probably should stop, changing that statement slowly. I won't hurt you much, more than I have to, unless I need a lower average in the class. In which case, what's that?
Why would you do that? Why do they want us to have lower averages?
Because they believe that all of you are average.
Well, that's rude.
I know, isn't it though? Fundamentally, the university believes that a random selection of students that sign up for a class should all be completely average and therefore should fall into this very predefined rate. But you want to know the worst thing? They're mostly right.
We're just average.
Well, most large groupings of students, like if I take a SOC 100 class, I've never, ever had to mess with an average at all, except to go up. Because I added all of the above to like 10 of my 50 questions one time. And I like my normal average is about a 78 in SOC 100, and it went down to like 62. I was like, okay, lesson learned. First year students cannot deal with all of the above as possible. It was just, we learned. We all learned. So then I was like, everybody gets 5 extra marks. So my class average isn't too low. But outside of that one experience, they fall directly into the range that the university says. So apparently they do know something. I don't know what, but they know something. Yeah, I suppose they've seen enough of you that they're like, first year students should fall into this range. And they do, mostly. Except in engineering, where it's like they should all get like 5. It's like 50% is the average. I don't know why. Different world. Arts has its own scale. It mostly works out. I got in trouble one time for being 0.1 above the average range. I was like, I'm close. They're like, close doesn't count. We're fighting grade inflation. I'm like, okay. Yes. Yeah. Apparently at Yale, or was it at Harvard? There was a professor who's like, here's your mark on the grade inflation scale. Here's the actual mark I think you would have deserved back in 1990. And it was like, you got a B. And he's like, yeah, if it was 1990, you've got a C minus. I think this guy was a jerk, probably. But whatever. All right. Back to finishing talking about mixed methods so I can let you go early instead of telling stories about chainsaw-wielding mice. Okay, so the technical argument. So the technical argument is more of an argument in a sense that you can use them together, right? That qual and quant are just techniques, right? So this does the smart thing, I think, which is it instrumentalizes methods. Rather than lingering on like the underlying philosophical incompatibility epistemologically and ontologically, the technical argument I think is a smart one. It's like these are tools, right? So instead of saying like, this is like how I've always thought, I deeply instrumentalize methods because I think it works. It's like quant and qual it's like a screwdriver and a power drill, right? Or actually those are too similar. A hammer and a drill. Right? They do different things. They're for different purposes, but they can ultimately kind of enrich each other. You know, the selection of a method is the decision about which window the researcher will open to look into a room. And then it's like, okay, I want to look in 2 different rooms. I can use 2 different methods together, right? So I think the technical argument, and I think this is where like really good researchers who want to do in-depth studies end up, right? We end up doing kind of both methodologies, right? Quant and qual in some mix, if you have the budget and the army of grad students to interview people and all of this stuff. Just think of them as tools in a toolbox, right? That they can be used, interchanged. They look at different things, right? Or it's like, I'm going to use this hammer to look in the window of the kitchen. Terrible metaphor, but I'm going with it. And then I'm going to open a different window and look in the living room. You'll see different things about the same. Okay, I've lost myself in the metaphor. Forget the metaphor, right? Looking into the room. They'll just give you a different look at different things, right? Stethoscope and telescope, different tools for looking into things. And that's how I think you should think of methods. Okay, very quickly, because I think I'm almost done. So, 3 proposed multi-strategy research approaches: triangulation, facilitation, and complementarity. Okay, so triangulation, right? The use of quantitative research to corroborate qualitative findings and vice versa, right? So basically, right, you think of like triangulation, right? This is a metaphor from like radio signals. If you want to find the source of a radio signal, you kind of look at something from different points, right? So like, you know, the radio signal's here. In order to figure out where it is, you need kind of 3 places to kind of locate that one, so you can measure the distance between 3 different points in a radio signal, right? This is what the idea of triangulation is. So think of this in terms of kind of research strategies, right? You can use quantitative research and qualitative research, or vice versa, to check each other's findings, right? So if you find, say, a trend in your quantitative data, you know, and you come up with your hypothesis, right, and you test that hypothesis statistically, right? So let's say you get a direction of a proposed direction of correlation, right? Okay, let's just think of a phenomenon, right? Let's say that you have this theory that the growth of the phenomenon in religion of the nothing, and people who identify as nothing in particular, was driven particularly by the election of Donald Trump. And what you find in the quantitative data is, right, you hit 2016 and the number of people who say they're nothing in particular, you know, goes like that. And you're like, great, okay, I have a trend and I have my hypothesis. It pans out in the data, right? The growth of the nuns increased exponentially after 2016. What you would do then is you go and you take your qualitative approach and you find a bunch of people, you know, you post on Reddit r/atheist or whatever, and you go and you're like, hey, I'm looking to interview people who decided that they were no longer religious. They started identifying as nothing in particular after 2016, and you ask them a bunch of questions as to why they changed their religious affiliation. And then maybe they tell you, oh, it was because of Donald Trump and the terrible Republicans, or maybe they tell you something else, right? Whatever it happens to be. But you're then sort of checking, because you're like, I see this, you know, correlative relationship in the quantitative data. Can I then go and talk to people and see if they interpreted it in that same way? Did they make those decisions for that same reason, right? So you're checking one piece of data against another. And often, right, you're checking that quantitative hypothesis. This is probably the way I think it works best, honestly. I suppose you could do it the opposite, right? You start talking to people and they're like, yeah, I left because of Donald Trump. And you're like, oh, I wonder if I see a big growth in the nuns after Trump was elected. You go do a survey and find that. So you could check it in both ways. I think that, my opinion, it's not the gospel. The quant data hypothesis that's tested, which you then check with qualitative research, I think works better than the other way around. But, you know, whatever. Man, my illustrations are so good. Should have been an artist. Okay. I'm kidding. Well, for one, the screen shakes when I poke it, so it's really hard to do steady drawing. The other one is I 100% failed art class in elementary school, which I didn't even know was possible. I just didn't want to try. I'm like, I'm bad at this. I don't want to draw stuff. Okay. I think I was one of those students that's like, needs to try harder in art. I was like, no, don't want to. Okay. The use of one research, so facilitation, the use of one research strategy to assist with the research that uses a different strategy. Qualitative facilitates quantitative. Quantitative facilitates qualitative. Okay, so how does this work? So suggesting hypotheses, often by using qualitative data to generate hypotheses for quantitative data. So that's like kind of what I was talking about a second ago, right? You would use like, so this is, okay, this is almost always when you're talking about facilitation, you're almost always talking that one of them is being used almost as a pilot study, right? So this second point is the really key one. Sorry. This is the one that I always think of when I think of facilitation. Aiding measurement, often by using qualitative data to design questionnaire items, right? So how this would work, right, is sometimes if you just don't, like this is, okay, I'm going to use like a Donald Rumsfeld, obscure reference from like the early 2000s. He was the Secretary of Defense when the U.S. went into Iraq, you know, and he said you have known knowns, you have known unknowns, and you have unknown unknowns. This is kind of delving into, you know, known unknowns, things you know you don't know, right? So if you were like approaching a completely new research area and you really had no sense of how to even begin asking questions, like what would even be interesting themes to look at, right? Like how would you even like, I don't know, a topic you don't know anything about, right? You want to do a study of furries. And aside from me making jokes about furries through this entire class, you know absolutely nothing about furries, right? How would you design a survey that would be aimed at understanding the behavior of furries or their attitudes, right? Because you don't know anything about them, right? All you've seen is jokes on the internet. Or that one article about, you know, kids in high schools want to poop in a box. Aside from that, you know nothing, right? This true thing, apparently in the States, someone identified as a cat and wanted to use a litter box. Fun times. For no one, actually, but whatever. Okay. So you might just start with a pilot study, right? And you would go and you would interview, you know, some furries to just kind of get a lay of the land, right? So you'd use the qualitative data. You would go and you would do either semi-structured or maybe unstructured interviews with people just to try and get a lay of like, what are the themes? What are the questions I should be asking? You would analyze that, you would find the themes, and then you design your quantitative kind of survey out of that, right? So yeah, that's one way. Suggesting hypotheses, often used using qualitative data to generate a hypothesis for qualitative data to generate a hypothesis for quantitative research, right? Again, here it's like if you think you see a trend in the qualitative data, you can then go and test that, create a theory and test it using quantitative. This one, okay, the last one here, I will say is probably the one that now is almost impossible to do. But people have used this in the past. That's really, 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 really difficult now for a bunch of reasons. Okay, so providing research participants. Quantitative studies may identify people who could participate in qualitative research. If you control everything from stem to stern in terms of, say, the platform that you're using to do your quantitative analysis, you can do this. Like when in sociology, we used to have a research center called the Population Research Lab, which could actually send out surveys. It was really sophisticated, and apparently it made a profit of about $1 million a year. But for some reason, 7 years ago, the university decided we don't need that. We hate money and success because reasons. So they borked it completely. The university, we like metrics. Hey, we're making $1 million a year. Excuse me. That's like, oh, only $1 million? Well, I guess we're getting rid of you. Don't understand. The university, very logical. Okay, we used to be able to put a question at the end. Hey, could we contact you for a follow-up interview on this subject? And you'd get a lot of qualitative participants from that. And again, you can do this now if you control the whole process. The problem is the shift online. So the shift online has meant that almost inevitably you are now in the realm of platforms and other people's platforms. And one of the things that these platforms have in their terms of service is that you cannot ask, to contact people or for them to enter personal information that would identify them as part of your survey. So they can't even enter an email address, right? I tried to do this we were doing a survey, we wanted to do qual follow-up, and I tried to do this using SurveyMonkey, and whichever platform Abacus provides, I can't remember which one it is now, and they were like, yeah, we can't do that. That's actually against our terms of service. You can't do any recruiting for qualitative portions that we don't control through this platform. So this has become really difficult. It is a good idea, it's just become really difficult unless you control the platform, which you don't. Okay, unless you are Leger, which you aren't. Okay, the last one, complementarity. Complementarity is basically using two or more approaches where a single approach would not be sufficient, filling the gaps, right? And again, I think this is where the National Study of Youth and Religion, typically did its best work, right? This is like true, kind of true mixed methods, right? Or true multiple methods. I think complementarity is where, there are gaps where one approach kind of can't answer a particular type of question, right? So quantitative is really good at the what and big social trends. Qualitative is really good at the why, right? So this is one of the kind of ways that you could, conceptualize a mixed methods, right? Is I'm going to do complementary mixed method research where I'm going to, my favorite direction for this is always start with quantitative and then move to qualitative, right? It's like figure out the big social trend and then try to dig into the why questions, right? Why do people think this way? Why is their understanding of this particular phenomenon informed by the things that you found in that quantitative research? So it can be used to illustrate static and process features in social phenomenon, right? So like things that are changing or things that are staying the same, you can ask people about it if you're doing kind of mixing the methods. It can be used to collect data at different levels, right? This is probably the most reasonable way, right? You're collecting different kinds of types of data that are all going to work together, say, when you write it up. So you're going to say, this is how it would look when you're writing your book, right? You would have a whole bunch of charts and stuff, and you're like, this is what we found in the quantitative data. This is the trend we saw. And hey, then we interviewed Jane. And Jane said this, and that really backs up our statistical kind of reading of everything, right? And that's, the complementarity, right? It's like each of these gives you a different picture. Or Jane explained that the reason that she did this was this. And so now we better understand that trend that we're seeing because Jane, Jack, Joe, Jesus, or Jesus all said kind of the same thing, right? Qualitative data can be used to interpret the relationship between variables in quant data, right? So sometimes it can give you the directionality, right? So one of the things that you'll always find with quantitative, right, is that you're going to propose a directionality for the data, right? So you find a correlation and you're going to say, and this is the problem with stats and surveys, you're going to say, hey, I think this is the independent variable and I think this is the dependent variable, but you might never be entirely sure. But if you actually go and ask people, sorry, I'm going to use an example I used last time, you became less religious and you use a lot of porn. Which came first? Did you become less religious, or did you become less religious because you were using porn and you felt ashamed and it distanced you from your religious communities? I read a paper about this the other day and literally said, hey, this is what we think is the directionality, but we need qualitative data to back it up and we don't have any, right? So we think this is the direction. We don't think it's, religion protecting people from porn use. We think it's porn use driving religiosity down. So they think it's a secularizing factor, but they're like, we need that qual data to back it up. I read weird stuff. I'm sorry. It's very interesting. And I was like, ooh, shiny. I'm absolutely going to integrate this into like 3 different courses. Okay, different methods can be used to study different aspects of a phenomenon. So the two methods can be used from the start of the research to answer 2 different sets of questions, right? You might be going 2 tracks at the same time, right? So you're doing interviews and you're doing surveys at the same time. I don't love this approach. I've seen people do it. I just think do one, then the other, and use one to illustrate the other really well. I think this works a lot better. I don't love the 2 tracks at the same time because it feels like you can end up running in parallel and then the data is hard to make sense of, but that's just my orientation. No question, Sarah. Go.
For like consent letter, like if we were to use this on our project, would I have to have 2 different consent letters? Like if I wanted to do surveys first and then interviews, would it have to be separate?
No. Just have the one for because I've kind of got part 6 tacked on as a like, hey, if you were.
Okay.
So don't worry about writing a second consent letter or anything like that. And I won't look at it anyway, so it's all good. No. I mean, in theory, yes. Like in the real world, you would have to have a consent letter. Like how this works. Something happened. How am I doing for time, by the way? Oh, I promised you would go early and I lied so hard. You would have like typically, like if someone's doing an online survey, it's like, hey, this is who I am, this is the project, blah, 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 blah. By continuing, you consent and all that stuff. And then when someone shows up to an interview, you have a physical form that you have them sign, right? So yeah, you'd have to have it for both, or a focus group or whatever. You'd have to have consent letters for both. But in our case, let's not worry about it, because I don't need you to make 2 consent letters. You already did one for quant. So you're fine, right? You know how to do it, or you don't. But almost everyone got 5 out of 5 on it, so it's all good. Okay. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, right? When a researcher can't rely on either quant or qual to tell the whole story of a research question, right? You can use a multi-method strategy to fill in the gaps. This comes, obviously, and I've been kind of talking about this the whole time. It's a 2-step approach, and you have to think about, and this, definitely say this in your part 6, right? If you're going to do something like a fill in the gaps or complementary strategy, which one are you going to do first, right? So like there's the priority decision. Will you do the data gathering? Will the principal data gathering tool be qualitative or quantitative? Which one are you going to start with? Which one's going to inform the other one, right? So if you're going to develop your interview questions based on what you find in the quantitative data, then, your principal one is going to be quantitative. You're going to start with that, right? And you're going to do your surveys. You're going to do your data analysis. And once you've done that, then you're going to develop your kind of qualitative tool, right? Or in the sequence decision, right? Should it use a complementary method? Or should the complementary method be used first as a preliminary to principal method, or second as a follow-up, right? Okay, I would tend to always put the principal one first, right? Because I want the big tool that gives me the most information, which is, I think, always the quant one, but that's just me, to be the one that I use first, so that it informs the other part, and I can dig into that data. But obviously, right, sometimes you have, say, your principal method is going to be your quantitative survey, but you don't know anything about furries, so you do that preliminary qualitative work to figure it out. So that technically is your secondary method, but you're doing it first because it's informing the big chunk, like your big, most important part of your project. You have to figure out that sequencing, right? My favorite one is quant to qual, right? You do a survey that then informs what questions you should ask to figure out the why and the directions of causation and all of that stuff, but that's just an opinion. I will say this, there is no wrong answer here. There's just justifications for why you did it and how good your justification is, right? Because like I've seen good projects go any direction, right? Quant to qual, qual to quant, qual as the secondary method, but done first as a kind of pilot project, or, quant as a pilot project to figure out general themes, to dig into interviews, right? There's no wrong answer. There's just justifications. Okay. Kind of like serial killing, right? No right answers, just justification. No, I'm kidding. Okay. Problem of generality. In qualitative research, there's a tendency in qualitative research to do, kind of present data without being able to say whether it's generalizable, right? Whether you can generalize it, how typical it is, right? You did a whole bunch of interviews of, some group or other that dresses in large furry animal costumes. But you're just giving anecdotes about that particular group without kind of saying something about more general things. Quantification can be of use here, right? To fight generalization, you could add a quantitative component to tell you how common a particular phenomenon is, in society or in subcultures. Like, I don't know, if you found something interesting about furries, you could then be like, oh, we also find this in all of society, we know because we did a big survey. I'm really trying to get through this before to let you go at least 1 minute early. Ooh, that is bad colors on this screen. These usually are beautiful on the better projectors, which is why I keep forgetting to change them. And it looks lovely. It's super high contrast on my nice quality laptop screen, but it looks like garbage here. Hang on. Screw it. Forget it. Keep all my doodles. I love my doodles. Let's fix that quickly. And it'll tell me how... Oh, and this is the last slide too. Yay. All right, I already kind of talked about this anyway. Qualitative research can help interpret the relationship between variables, right? It can help you figure out directionality in causation, right? It can really, really help you figure out, because people will tell you what happened first, right? With quantitative data, all you can kind of say is that two things changed at once, and a lot of times you're assuming what your independent variable is. That doesn't always work really well, and sometimes you're sort of stuck. Yeah, it can help you find intervening variables too, right? Like one of the things that qualitative work can really help in quantitative research is if there is a third variable that you didn't think of, right? It's like you've got a movement in both and you're assuming a kind of, and the timing works, you're assuming that there isn't something spurious, right? Sometimes, qualitative work will actually help you suss out a spurious kind of relationship, because people will be like, actually, it wasn't the porn that caused me to leave religion, it was Trump, right? I just happened to start using a lot more porn when Trump became president. What a disturbing idea I've just put out there, to make myself feel better. I don't know. Like, sometimes the examples get away from me, right? One that is influenced by the independent variable, but in turn has the effect on the dependent variable, right? So you can find these kind of spurious relationships in the data. All right. Final questions on mixed methods. All right, go have fun with Celine. I ended 2 minutes early. I'm sorry. I hope to do that faster, but lots of questions about the major lab assignment, so I blame you. It's your fault. Uh-oh. I forgot to change that. Oh well, they're going to have fun.